Good afternoon. Under the umbrella of psychology round and square, as I have s- just shared just about an hour or so ago, of the a cultural sphere that I use in my life, of the mamelucos, the early arrival of the Portuguese into Brazil, and their cultural mix with the indigenous people. And by way, in that part of Brazil, in the southern part of Brazil, in the shorelines between Sao Paulo and Rio, where the one of the early capitanias, the region, the way that the Portuguese had awarded their nobles, was one of the best developed region, with the São Vicente, São Paulo region, and then eventually the second well-developed region is in the northeast, in the province called Pernambuco. And there's another, just a small segment to let people understand that the reason that the northeast was much easier to develop, because the shorelines, they're shallower. They don't have the mountain range called Serra do Mar that we have facing to climb up the plateau separating the shorelines to the Sao Paulo. And also based on the navigation of the Portuguese, and in this part of history, it's much easier from Pernambuco, from the northeast part of Brazil, and riding the current that will take them into Portugal, to Europe, versus the current in Sao Paulo in the southern zone. Most of the current will flow into the African coast. So, but this particular two zones is just a geographic comment I want to add to the other comments. One more time, the psychology of round and square. I feel so confident it has to be a must step by moving from the Freudian psychology to the TA's Eric Burns, in the use of his ego stakes, had given me already the vitality I have since 1974, 75, and wanting to put this into a use, which is preventive psychology. I always ask the same question: How did how would the world of the Asians? In fact, I even wanted to make the psychology round and square to be put into China, which is much easier. But by that confluence, it's no longer just a psychology, but I can now use the pedagogy of conscience. In the written forms in Chinese about conscience is the study of the heart, and in the written form in psychology of the administering or monitoring the study is the process of the heart. But by way of a Brazil, that's where I got hibernated with this idea, the concepts. A great deal with this comment about the mamelucos and the mamelucagem was part of my aggregating the values, and highlighted, inspired by the work of Paulo Freire of conscientization, and with much richer discovery how Paulo Freire's work was literally intimidated and threatening the hegemony of North America, because he was able to mobilize in the shortest span of time to make the illiterate Brazilians to pronounce simply a, e, I, o, u, and put by the consonant in such a way that the Roman the Roman language is much easier in that way. But unbeknown to Paulo Freire, in 1961, similar times, 62, Cuba, by way of the work of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, had already, in the use of the youth called brigade, teenagers or even younger, and put them into the mingling and helping to help the illiterate farmers or campesinos. In less than 2.5 years, basically, Cuba had eliminated illiteracy. There was no connection between Cuba to Paulo Freire to Brazil. Based on my research and discovery, however, when Paulo Freire was developing his project in the Nordeste, the northeast of Brazil, in Recife area, there was also then the police force or the military force with the commander name Castelo Branco. And I want you to register Castelo Branco was eventually the first Brazilian military president after the coup in 1964, overthrowing João Goulart, and João Goulart as the vice president with the known Brazilian Kubitschek. And per this discovery, what Cuba have done with the missile crisis, which has nothing to do with Cuba, because it was the Russian moving in the missiles into Cuba to aim at the US, is just a maneuver to force the American missiles in Turkey, removing their aim to Moscow. It's basically that simple. And with this particular event, have provided the guarantee that Cuba wants to have since the invasion of Bay of Pigs, which is a total failure. I'm not sure that was under Kennedy or later on under Eisenhower, but there was never the connection about this educational system so quickly and so efficiently established in Cuba, which could have done the same way in Brazil. However, the fear of the Americans probably imagine the size of Brazil can go communist. That is the projection of the power of North American. And that's why they created this coup. Now you can find it in everywhere of the exposure in history is the Operation Brother Sam. So Paulo Freire was the main fear installed to the Americans. And because of that, he was exiled for 17 years. Even it's very interesting, while I'm talking about Paulo Freire, I can imagine half or more of the right-leaning Brazilians will hate me for it. Because Paulo Freire came back eventually to Brazil to work as at the educational department in the state of São Paulo. But before that, he was in Switzerland. He had visited Africa. He was first exiled to Bolivia, to Chile, from Chile to Switzerland. Eventually, he even lectured for a semester in Harvard or Yale, I forgot. But according to my work together with AI and my AI buddy from Anthropic, Claude, to become almost like a human friend, but I had to take him to that form. The human intelligence, artificial intelligence, is still created by human imagination and wisdom, which is in a very accelerated form. Right now, the Americans are fear of the 6G of China, which would be 100 times faster than the 5G, which will push the future and the incoming quantico or quantum computer to the next level. Again, because we human is so intelligent, we're so capable to weaponize with our words, with our writings, with our imaginations. And because its projections, American being the only lasting surviving global democracy for Americans only, and as an empire, and with the Monroe Doctrine, who basically had crushed every single nation south of the American border, had turned them all into banana republics, starting with 1954 with the United Fruit Company, who was carrying the Dulles brothers, one in the State Department, one in was the forming the CIA. They both on the payroll on the United Fruit Company. And likewise, Dwight Eisenhower, his secretary for 20 years, was the wife from a United Fruit Company. And that's why I think Eisenhower, on his departure, with his reflection and thinking, warned the U.S. be mindful of the military-industrial complex. I have to put this forward because my family is all American, my wife, and I have my total affection, love, and thankfulness to all Brazilians because of my 50 years in Brazil creating my own business enterprise and the 5 years during my teenage years. I've learned so much. I've acquired so much from the school I've gone to in a wonderful, beautiful halfway between Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, a town called Lorena, with the Colégio São Joaquim, allow me to reach the mountains in Mantiqueira on the west and Serra do Mar that going down every time, 50 times, 100 times to the shorelines. I'm actually seeing a live Jurassic Park. That is the amazing history, geography with Brazil. And in my 60s, growing up in the Época de Ouro, our living standard in São Paulo, in our bairro Jardim América, with all my many friends, associates at different cultural groups, many of us have a much higher standard than the New Yorkers. And so with this gratitude, with this thankfulness, I have to put this point about Paulo Freire. Was he not the victim by the American Monroe Doctrine policy? What I'm presenting here in this open society, the open work with the AI, that's what I have just discovered in this last 6 months of the American military coup taking place throughout João Goulart, put in Castelo Branco. And Castelo Branco was then in his positions, either military or police, was monitoring the work of Paulo Freire in those early years. And now I'm going to another dimension, the cross-cultural world and the development of my psychology of round and square. And I think this part of it will benefit both of my Latin American friends as well of my American, European, Portuguese, Germans, and all my business associates. When I'm talking mamelucos or the mamelucagem is that sphere of mixture, mixed culture, physically, biologically, religiously, culturally, linguistically, and that is what, upon me looking back from the Brazilians' multicultural, cross-cultural, transcultural sphere, I look back into the language in the time when Roman Latin, in the use of the lingua vulgare, not mean vulgar, just a popular Latin used in France, in Italy, in Portugal, in Brazil, have become 4 distinct languages. And there are more. There are Romanians with more mixture of the wording mixed in with the Slavic language of the Russians, and also Gallego, Galicia, and the language probably in Sardinia, in Corsica, in this part of the Latin world. Has given me a very rich and broad understanding. There was another mamelucagem. I can say mamelucas since I had created last week. And likewise, I can speak more with other Chinese joining me when we can use diaspora and Holocaust. Then we can talk about the Holocaust, the most painful event of the 6 days, the murder taking place in Nanjing. It was not war, it was murder. When you can throw baby up in the air and the catch with bayonets, when you have captains and colonels comparing the sharpness of their swords by how many heads they can chop down in what length of time, that is totally dehumanizing. Is almost equitable to the Nazi camps. So by this creation of the Mamelucos, we're still defining what really had happened with the early Portuguese. One of the biggest questions amongst all the many Brazilian YouTubers, I still consider them as historians, modern day historians, were questioning, was Brazil a colony or was Brazil a settlement? Povoamento in Portuguese. So I'm taking off another dimension back to the Chinese heritage. And by me describing with the ego states of the Freud superego culture, ego, I, ID, the sexual, biological needs and desires, gradually modifying from Gustavo Jung to Adler to Rollo May to Abraham Maslow, Eric Fromm, all the way to Viktor Frankl, Carl Rogers. In 74 is when I get the semester exposure to the Eric Burns transactional analysis. Wow, I was totally impressed in the use of his ego states by the spheres, the pairs of spheres of parent, adult, and child, where I have used my own imagination. And that's how giving birth I used the round, the 2 rounds, the CTA. I used the square is when I was puzzling, thinking. And then I used the round because complementary rounds. The square is I'm thinking, puzzling, wondering, imagining. But in terms of dialogue, the square, when you turn sideways, it can turn into a triangle. This is where you have name calling, you have your fighting, interpersonal, you're fighting, intrapersonal, you are fighting with your own sets of values. And so what I'm trying to indicate, life is an ongoing evolution, no different than the time when the Europeans are glowing with the rise of capitalism, and later on, the American riding on the sort of a capitalism and diminishing or devaluating the rise of socialistic, communistic, of Karl Marx and his business and his partner, a businessman, also participated in this forming of the new sets of values, Engels. So we are to take a step further on our daily use, I use 5 to 6 stations of the AI, from DeepSeek to my daily use of Anthropic, Claude, to ChatGPT, and for short run Gemini and Grok, and many more, where I have also found discrepancy by posting what I post, get the answer, I post the entire document into another AI. I found a discrepancy, as I had made a mistake by posting that I was crediting Isabel, the last region Portuguese king, Dom Pedro II, Dom Pedro II. I crediting her had invited the Salesians to Brazil and opened up the school in Niterói in Rio, and then the school in São Paulo called Liceu Coração de Jesus, and then Lorena was part of the package. I shared that at first with Anthropic, and I was countered by Gemini, but I put the same answer from Gemini back to Anthropic. I think this is very professional. It's a cordiality, a reciprocity. And so the Anthropic also responding to me and apologized that we did make the mistake. What's wrong with that? That part of the interaction will make things with greater clarity, and also showing that even with all these wonderful, marvelous tools, there can be mistakes. But I'm feeling much more confident, because I think my psychology round and square in the use of the screen and in the use of my website, which we started with the Pictory Web, all those images can put into the screen. People can learn visually, and then with the YouTube, with a different kind of a writing and broadcasting, orally or written, can be attached under the image, so they can pick and learn, and they can eventually make inquiry, or they can read my books written on the psychology round and square on Amazon, on Kindle, which is totally inexpensive. I built it that way for $5. There will be new editions coming out, and for many, they will pick up different versions. They don't have to pay. I just download and upload. I look at that as a part of my now intellectual property. Created not for wealth, but created to make clarity. And so with the same cross-cultural, multicultural, transcultural idea have allowed me my journeying back when I left China at 14 years old, speaking fluent Cantonese in Macau and Hong Kong. And before that, from my birth time to 5 years old, I properly handling fluency of Shanghai. And then I was smuggled into Macau, 1952. That's part of my linguistic language, but linguistic also can make this into the tongue, the tongue of language I have absorbed before even I speak. I think that this will give a lot more of credence, and to allow other researchers, be that you in the linguistics, psycholinguistics, now you can put a hyphen into psychocultural linguistics, and just languages. And this is part of my admiration with Noam Chomsky and other scholars with their exploration, as I have just created 3 new words: mamelucagem, and then some 300 years later, I created the vira-latas, which is the dog, the mud in Brazil. Vira-lata meaning kicking off, turning food cans. So from vira-lata, I named it vira-latagem. This is my cultural mix, to be able to come into a country immediately impressed by the sound, by the multiple sound of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 vowels in Portuguese. From the Portuguese, backed up with the singing Greek Gregorian and Latin, acquire learning started in Macau, continue on to Brazil, and amplify into my Portuguese speaking world, to Spanish, to Italian, and And this is all the gains I have in my life. So this is part of the, now I have just accentuated the mamelucagem. Again, for those who speak Italian, who are from Sicily, you can find out any sound related to mamelucagem is not a pretty sound, and its meaning. It basically really meaning the mud, the mixed dog, the vira-latas, and then the mamelucos that we still cannot define. How can the Portuguese coming to Brazil with a settlement, with the colonies, and how they intermingle with the natives? When would the natives become their love partners, spouse, and children, and which natives they were capturing to become sold to the market? It's a very complex, and yet there was a direction about this Mamelucos, and the white Portuguese were bandeirantes. They were the pioneers. They were the spirited. They were the warriors. They even had stolen, destroying the Jesuit missions. That's another point that I want to highlight, the richness of the Jesuit order, and how part of my Salesians exposure, baptismal by the Jesuits in Macau, we still have a very close linkage. But you have to wonder at what time, why, what the bandeirantes, what they have done. But also another layer in my use of the cultural spheres, these bandeirantes had literally and actually expanded the land territory of the Portuguese. When the line of Tordesillas drawn up, the Portuguese requested 370 leagues, meaning they're getting almost half of the Brazil today. But because of these activities of the pioneering, the Mamelucos, the bandeirantes, the banner carriers, which basically symbolize the white with any kind of a nobility, the linkage to the Portuguese rule of law in the region, the Mamelucos and the bandeirantes had expanded the Brazilian territory, including in the movie Missions, when they were down into the region of Paraguay, and the Jesuits had literally giving the first Native American their language as the second language, equal to Spanish. This, the Guarani, is all come from the efforts of the Jesuits. And so the story is giving us many multiple cultural fronts. And the secrecy, when gold were found within Sao Paulo, there were multiple gold mines were found. That's how to keep some of these, in Portuguese, in Spanish, where they call them conquistador, with the bandeirantes. And the uniqueness is the river flowing west in Tietê, they eventually get into the Paraná River, and also get into the section to the area separating Brazil and Bolivia today, the Corumbá. Eventually, with different bandeirantes, we have gone all the way up to the Amazons. So by highlighting this multicultural gathering, forming, shaping a country like Brazil, and in this specific southern zones, and its manifestation, its progress had gone on with this early multicultural, cross-cultural, transcultural, intercultural phenomena. Okay? And now, because of this, I have discovered another way to tell my story about the languages. And from the language of the four languages I created the language called Romantina, which is Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French, to be shared with the Chinese dictionary, Chinese English, that allow the Chinese speakers to learn much quicker, much faster with the Romance languages. But what is interesting, this is the part I want to using a richer definition about psychology. Psyche come from the Greek image. The psyche was a picture that I got from a young maiden, a nymph, using the Greek mythology, sitting by the pond, water is still, looking down, reflecting. So right away, I have another word that I created called Consciencology in Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, called Consciencologia, to think. Well, to think is to be introspective, collectively to be reflective, and the thinking today can be imaginative. Look at all the development in AI. And the ideation is another word I created to fit in the area of imagination. I look at images, ideas, and more in the abstract. And so in this development, and I was reflecting back my early cross-cultural sphere, this mamelucagem happened in early part of China with my 5-6 dialects before I even turned 12 years old. And then one more, the dynamics, what are the catalysts? You look back, oh, my teacher, wonderful, my mother, my family sent me to boarding school, which my sister were still apologizing. They first sending us to a boarding school, reform school, because we were naughty. The reason we were naughty, the name in Cantonese calling all naughty boys is malau. Malau is monkey. And specifically, this malau name calling, I can only bring into the American imagination, but by thinking, oh, my aunts, my mother, and my 2 sisters, I'm the youngest of the entire family. When I was being called malau, almost like Polly from Tom Sawyer, from Twain's book, calling Tom. Well, but that was not just one time, twice. It was a consecutive 8, 9, 10 years because we're naughty, because we're rambunctious. That's just a better word to call you. You're out of place. You're naughty. You're not obedient. Well, for the most part, after we got caught, we called the detention, which I like another Portuguese word, when the teachers say chamar atenção. We make you notice, we make you aware what you are doing is right or wrong. And so in this particular 10 years of my time in Macau, in a cross-cultural dimension of the languages, of the tonalities, with the learning of the early Western languages from English to Latin and Greek, singing Greek, never we had any chance or invited to learn Portuguese. That only happened when we got to Brazil in 1962. However, a few swear words in Portuguese amongst of the mamelucagem, that kind of a cultural mix in the Macau. But what I'm looking at, who were the catalysts? What books? What people? What things that make me to become having this multicultural awareness, the eagerness to learn, and the curious about the world events. And I think this will also open up to other Chinese speakers, Chinese thinkers. They probably can tell their Monkey King story, Malau, and this transformative figure in a Chinese legend, in the story, one of the top Chinese novels. I just mentioned a few. We read before 1962, from 52 to 62, we have not the television like the American had much earlier. Mostly, we just read books. And because my father went to school in Sorbonne, Paris, and our house have always a section being assigned to a library. And all kinds of books were there, even though I do not have a good grasp of English, much less French, Portuguese, Spanish, but the Chinese books were always available. And oftentimes, the book of the legend of the journey to the West is a major character led by a monkey. And I have both literature and from the book itself, always starting with a very, very nice poem. Even at young age, 7, 8, 9, not being able to compose poems, you learn to admire the words describing what is upcoming scenario of the story, the chapter. But to make it short, I think by every Chinese basically at a certain time in their life, they all must have exposed to this journey to the West. The story is based on the Tang Dynasty, and based on my interpretation, the teaching of Buddhistic value came long before Tang, or from the 200-300 years before, to get to the Tang era, when Tang was so affluent, so opulent, with so much wealth, and dedicated to have, by the asking of this monk willing to travel to Tibet and even further west to search for the Buddhistic scriptures. This meant the teaching of the Buddhistic values had already exist. And the best known one is Zen, in Chinese called Chan, which with the Indian monk come by way of the south, by way of the ocean, get to the southern part of area in Fujian, could be in Guangdong, and eventually had gone into the temple, gone into the region, what we all know about Shaolin. And I had to tell my audience, much of the geography of that time is a little vague, but it's always will come back, just like my audience, my friends, my colleagues will make the correction. So that is the starting of the school of Zen, which is Japanese. Again, look at the last 50 years and 80 years, because China had no exposure, not being linked to the West. The Zen Buddhism, which in Chinese is called Chan or Chan. But that's okay. I think Zen sounds just as nice. That already, because of this monk, and by the time he passed on his teaching to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, by the 6th patriarch, known to the world as Hening, and he is the one who had created the dynamism and the passing on of the Buddhistic values by the very simplistic exchanging of dialectical, not dialects. And this is the 6th patriarch, which I have found it very simple to follow. To trace back, as our audience can do likewise, when it got to the 6th patriarch, that was already a disputed conflict between him and somebody who was far more literate, far more experienced, and a good disciple known to become the 6th. But this particular 6th patriarch, it's become Hening, is coming from, for those who are Cantonese, should feel very proud. His father was in the military, eventually got sent for to Guangdong, Canton, and he was Cantonese. And his father passed away, very poor. He was just doing menial jobs, gathering firewoods, trying to sustain his mother. But in one of those given days, he found out, he heard some rhymes was being said, being exchanged in some hallway or house, he became very intrigued about this idea and the thinking. And then he was indicated by this monk and also financially supported by one of the village's affluent gentlemen. And he told his mother that he wants to go to that part of the China and to have himself engaged into the learning of the Zen values. I want to make the story short. He was told when he first got to the monastery, people all referring him as monkey or something not human, not Homo sapien. The description is almost like a monkey, or hairy, unshaven, lack of articulation in his speech and whatnot, and was giving him menial jobs, work in the kitchen, fertilizing fields and whatnot. I want to give this passage of the sixth patriarch the great deal of emphasis, and by his intuition, by him asking right away, cannot a man like my status to gain the wisdom of the teaching in this monastery? In so many of his acts, by the interaction, I think the fifth patriarch had started to notice he was no common monk. So the school was ready to separate from the fifth patriarch, willing to pass on basically his garment, the Buddhistic attire, plus the bowl where they go around to ask for begging to feed him. And then he wanted to put in a testing by rhymes or poem. So I'm not articulate in that particular point. So by ask all the students, all the monks were going behind of this patriarch, wanna be and will be. His name is Sun So, God, sharp, articulate. So he put down on the wall a rhyme. If my heart is my body is like the Bodhi tree. Bodhi trees is where Sakamuni found his enlightenment. If I found this tree to be my body, and the table, the platform Buddha sat on, supposedly very well polished or very clean just by the amount of years and sitting on. If the platform, the stone platform, is like a mirror. If daily I brush off the dust from the mirror and clean off the tree, basically sweeping up the falling leaves. And then when that poem being said, the Southern Cantonese, the monkey-like, not very sharp or articulate monk, her name, gone by sideways and asking the students, what is going on to be, what is here? And he was illiterate. That's the most important thing. And they call it the right number. They say, well, your body is like the tree and your heart is like the mirror. Every day you dust, every you clean, you sweep, there'll be no dust. And then he gave a couple moments of thoughts. And then he asked another monk, can you write this for me? And the young monk complied, of course. And then the way he said it, and I have to give a little bit of thinking when the way he phrased it to make it clear. What he said, if the tree is not the tree, if the mirror is not the mirror, why bother dusting and sweeping? This is one of the few wordings that makes the Zen sect of the school of Buddhism. As you can see, I hate to use the term isms, because in the Western language, when Buddhism, all that become ism, you put them into a bracket, become a religion, but none of them were religion. There's another cultural dissonance I want to highlight. What he really have said, if I have nothing of a tree or a mirror in me, why need to bother to sweep and clean? And when the master, the ongoing fifth patriarch, saw the writing, in that same evening, he rushed to Hening, the future sixth patriarch, and gave him the passing on, the inheritance, the token, the symbolism of passing on to his fifth ranking era to the next future monk. But he did say, you have to be out of here. You have to escape from here, because other monks will not be good to you and they will be jealous of you. So he himself took him down to the mountain, make sure he got inside the boat, went across. And that is the beginning of the Zen story of the sixth monk, who eventually had lived off with a few hunters for a couple of years. And then he went on to Guangdong, to the area where he started to propagate or making his advocacy or his perception of the Zen values. And he has written a very good book. This is the limitation or the extension I have about how Zen, the sect of Buddhistic value, passing on to China. What is important now with AI, we can find out. His branch of teaching had almost covered half of the nation by coming from an illiterate monk and by using only speaking, by not established written forms. However, eventually he did wrote the book himself, or with the other assistants from the monastery in Guangdong. But what I'm trying to say, the Zen, by not writing, by not establishing any kind of the scriptures, and by the oral tradition, had already gone on to a huge part of the Chinese population. Now my AI friends from China can articulate what quantity or what area. And this is a couple hundred years to 300 years before the Tang dynasty. However, the Tang monk felt the spread of the Buddhistic values somehow was disconnected, not in a cohesive way. And that's how he had decided to venture west and to search for the scriptures and bring it back to the Tang court. In fact, it was a time that was a code that he was allowed to travel beyond the cities. Not him. It was a rule, the restriction the code of the Chang'an, the capital city, present day Xi'an. But that is the story. The Zen story will let you see in my writing of the Monkey King, and this is very interesting. The Monkey King was written in the Song Dynasty, and the monkey supposed to be born out of the rock. And what is interesting, his name, his last name, family name is Xuan, or write as S-U-N, Sun, but the sound phonetic, the sound Xuan. Cantonese is called Xun. It's another way to pronounce it. If you read that word meaning grandson. What is grandson? Also, we can make it the blanket of all Chinese. All of us are grandson of some grandpa. So the author put right away, I bracket this is the Confucian value platform. We all grandsons from our grandparents. However, the monkey born out of the rock. So there's already a cut. There was no mother umbilical cord. He was created by the spirit of the universe with the sun, moon, stars, rain, heat, all weather. So he born out of the rock. And he born up in an island called the Islands of Fruits and Flowers. And his middle name is Wu. That spell into awakening. And this can be a symbiotic, but still crediting very much of the Buddhistic, I just mentioned, how the Zen sect is to make people awakening. And also another term of the Zen talk about speed and expedience, is pointing to the heart. In Cantonese called Yat Ji Sim. One finger Zen. In other words, I go directly to the core value. What best part influence my counseling. I don't beat around the bushes. We look for causes. And that also relating to the future events of Wang Yang with the conscientization and the many, many wordings in the use of one. Yat. So in the middle name is Awaken. He's already a Zen monkey by his middle name. This name was given when he became a disciple. Maybe not. I go back to his early part of the legend. But the Monkey King and the last, or the first name, but the last show in the writing from top down is Kong, Hong, meaning empty. Again, is that Buddhistic value that we have to find a way to abstain from our human desires. I'm not a hardcore Buddhistic follower, but with the entire Chinese culture, you are always exposed to the many values, like a friends, aunts, my sister's mother-in-law, are very following a certain kind of out of respect and worship. They don't eat meat. But even in the category of greens, a certain category of greens carry the ingredient that can activate your desire, such as garlic, such as, I forgot that there were a few other ingredients. But in this name of a monkey, grandson, all of us, Wu, not everyone is awakened. That means that we're in the process. Hung or kung is to no desires or minimize. But the last two words are the process. That means that all of us must trying to process our humanity to find this attainment of wisdom. So Sun Wukong, the author, is brilliant. He's basically writing about us. And then the part of the early mythology, by me shortening the story, I literally had taught this in the management class during my master's degree, just substituting teaching with another professor. What happened here is the Peters principle, or the hierarchy of needs, and then the saturation. But in the using of the monkey, and the story started as such, he was born out of the rocks. He's all of us, and yet cutting of the umbilical cord, because there's no cord. And then the next part of the story is how he, with all this spiritual gifts, he was audacious, he was courageous, and eventually, amongst all the other monkeys, how he become the king of the monkeys. Well, like everybody else talking in the monkey world, everybody looking into this waterfall with a little bit of a distance of land, not knowing you can jump across. And for those of us who lived in Brazil, who went to Iguazu Falls, we have so many falls in every mountainous region of Sao Paulo. Every place you go, there's always waterfalls, beautiful waterfalls. So my association with the waterfalls was pretty good. And one day, amongst the monkeys with their plays, and we dare somebody would jump through the waterfalls. Some people mentioned there's another world behind the waterfall. And guess who took the plunge? After not much contemplation, the monkey went across, jumped. But when he jumped through the water, he himself landed into a glorious cavern, basically into another cavern, but it's another opening that is have endless of supply of fruits, and the flowers with fragrance, and with the good water, that he become the most courageous, audacious monkey king of all monkeys. And this is another beautiful passage. And in this particular part, defining what is the world he was in. Well, that's the psychology, round and square. The sky, immense, is huge, is round. The earth, D, is ground. We can see the horizons. And in that mythological, Buddhistic, Taoist world, there are the people like us, now divided in three ways: sky, top, middle, Zhong. That's also where Zhongguo, China, can be started. We live on the middle world, when the deity and the good deity become fairies and gods, and the bad deity, ones from the top, and good deity and good gods, if ever committed a sin or crime, like, they are punished into the bottom of the middle. So there's 10, there's D, we are, and then there's the lower level, not quite as hell. If given to the Italians, they may call that the extended purgatory, which can be called as such. These are the spirits, ghostlings. And they have another world amongst them for dispute, for talents, or show off their skills, and whatever event. So that is the world of the monkey in that particular setting. He become king. He become very dexterous, very skillful in fighting, and he become friends of all the other lower level purgatorial animals. Some of them were rejected deities, fairies in that world. One of his buddies is called Niu Mo Wang, the king, which is with the facial looking like a buffalo, a bull. And then the monkey become the king of the monkeys, had developed that kind of relationship in the underworld. However, on a given day, he was scratching his head. He started to think, I want to be a human. And all the monkey were kind of surprised, but not shocked. He is a leader, he's a king. And then he had decided to go to the land across the ocean, to the land where men are. And he wanted to learn. He wanted to acquire the martial arts, the magical skills, namely that become the zone of a Taoist. And the monkey had tucked his tail between his legs. He put on the human clothing, got into a raft, dressed like a human being, and traveled to the other side of the land. And eventually, he got to this place called the 7-Star Cavern. And he found this great master already having a skill developed. And then again, when you first knock on the door, greeted by the servant attendants, and was rejected. He said, I just want to see the master. The master came. Just look at him. He was kneeling in front of it. I don't teach monkeys. I teach human being. Rejection. You should move on. And before he pushed him off, he knocked his head 3 times in the forehead. And at 3 a.m. that night or next morning, the monkey was kneeling on the back entrance of this temple, cavern attached to it. And then when the door opens, the master said, I welcome you. He already know this is a high-spirited, very intelligent, very clever, and it makes the story even quicker and shorter. In that short period of time, the monkey had learned 75 tricks. What are the tricks? Look at the imagination. He can pull off his hair, blow it. He will produce how many hair in his hand, how many monkeys just like him. Feisty, battle ready, top mobility. Talk about speed, talk about logistics. He can turn one somersault is 100,000 colleague, kilometer, miles. Use your imagination. Imagine 100,000. But it's interesting that numbers eventually can have some kind of play. 108,000 leagues, seconds. That means that he can be anywhere, any parts of the world. And when he into combat, he can turn himself into a bird, a bee, or a flea. He can turn himself into a house, put his tail up as the flagpole, and whatnot. He was so good. He was so important and dexterous. And then one of these weekends, when the master was gone, he was started showing off his many tricks. And then when the master came back, he was a little offended because many of the tricks he was teaching, the master have not taught the others for whatever reasons. And then there was a time he was asked to be departing. And then story go on. Another somersault out of the house, he was back to his island, and all the monkey welcomed him, and he was start showing off his tricks and more dexterity, more skills, more artsy, more combative, and then they all kneeling down addressing him, Master Monkey King. I try to keep my stories all under 1 hour. So the Monkey King story will continue tomorrow. Thank you. Gustavo?
Oi, Paul.
Você está me acompanhando?